The termination letter arrived at 700, same as the shuttle manifest, same as the supply invoices, same as everything else that moved through the Colonial Research Bureau's Depot 6. A document was a document. Cale Morden read it standing in the corridor outside Director Halst's office, her breakfast still in her hand, and she understood that she had made a choice 3 days ago she was only now being allowed to pay for. She folded the letter once, put it in her coat pocket, and ate the rest of her roll. The depot was loud this hour. Loading arms groaned over cargo bays on the north side of the facility. The floor vibrated in the slow, oceanic rhythm of docked freighters cycling their engines against their tethers. Cale had worked here 4 years, long enough that the vibration felt like breathing to her. Inhale on the down thrust, exhale on the idle, the great structural lung of the station cycling in and out while the work got done around it. She had cataloged 47 species of alien specimen in those 4 years, supervised 11 xenobiology survey expeditions, written the assessment reports that had kept 6 alien research assistants from being reclassified in ways that would have moved them from the research side of the ledger to the revenue side. She had done all of this quietly, competently, and without drawing attention to herself, because that was what the job required. Quiet, competent, invisible. She had stopped being invisible 3 days ago. The cage was in Bay 12. She had not meant to find it. She had been rerouting around a coolant spill on the B corridor floor, taking the long way past the secondary holding docks, when she heard a sound she had never heard before outside of a recording. Or rather, a sound she had heard only in field logs, only in the audio files of researchers who had actually gotten off the station and into the real dark, who had sat on alien soil with real alien weather and documented what they heard there. A low, pulsing tone, 3 beats, a pause of 2 counts, 3 beats again. The KVETH distress signal. She knew it from a xenoacoustics seminar she had attended in her 2nd year, which she had attended because the title interested her, and because professional development was free on Tuesdays and there was nothing else to do. Cale had stopped walking. She had stood in the corridor for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took her brain to finish arguing with itself about whether she had actually heard what she had heard. Then she turned, went through the secondary door, and there they were. The cage was standard colonial containment, 6 feet by 8, reinforced alloy framing with an atmosphere control unit bolted to the top. On the depot registry, it would be listed as a secure specimen holding unit, because that was the category that had been checked when it was logged. Inside it, a KVETH female sat on the floor with her secondary and tertiary arms wrapped around a bundle held against her thorax. Her primary arms were chained to the cage wall at shoulder height, thick alloy chain, the kind used for structural load-bearing purposes, completely unnecessary for a single unarmed individual, overkill by any measure of actual containment need, chosen because it was what was available or because whoever had done it had wanted to be certain, or both. She could not lower her primary arms. She had been in that position long enough that the joints showed bruising visible even through the KVETH's natural dorsal plating, bruising under the bioluminescence, which was how Cale noticed it, because the bioluminescence was the particular shade Cale had only ever seen in research photographs filed under the tag, fear-sustained. Not the sharp, bright flicker of acute terror, not the fading amber of exhaustion, the dim, steady, persistent blue-green glow of something that had been afraid for a very long time and had arrived at the stage of fear that no longer expected anything to change. The bundle moved. Cale went very still. The bundle was a child, a KVETH infant, maybe 8 months by its size in standard developmental terms, curled inside the mother's secondary arms with its face toward the mother's thorax and its own bioluminescence glowing a warm amber that caught the fluorescent light of the bay and turned it into something almost golden. Newborns ran warm. She knew their light stabilized in the 1st year, shifted toward the cooler spectrums as they aged, but in infancy it held the amber, the honey orange, the color that KVETH adults apparently associated with home. She knew that from a survey report she had filed. She had filed a great many survey reports. She had spent 4 years building a thorough, useless knowledge of a species she had never seen in the field. And now one of them was sitting in a cage in Bay 12 with her child in her arms chained over her head, and her light the color of long, resigned fear. Kale stood outside the cage for 2 full minutes. Then she went to find Director Halst. She found him at his desk, which was not unusual. Director Halst conducted his business sitting down. He was a bureaucrat of the precise, insulated variety, not cruel in the way that required intention, but careful in the way that was almost as bad, because it surrounded every decision with so many layers of procedural language that the thing at the center of the decision became abstract, a classification rather than a fact. He looked up from his desk when she came in, and he did not seem surprised to see her. That was the first thing she noticed. He was not surprised. He had known she would come. He was polite. He explained that the KVETH female and her offspring were property of the late Dr. Saren All, a xenobiologist contracted to the Bureau, who had died 6 weeks ago during a survey mission. His estate, which included his research materials, his equipment, and his specimens, had been inventoried according to standard Bureau protocol for deceased contracted researchers and sold to cover his outstanding institutional debts. The KVETH pair had been purchased by licensed agents of the Vreth Collective, who were arriving in 4 days to collect what they had paid for. Kale said they were not property. They were sentient persons. The KVETH had been sapient classified under the Interspecies Accord of Sentient Persons for 30 years. Director Halst said the classification was a matter under ongoing Bureau review, given the specific circumstances of Dr. All's acquisition. Kale said there was no provision in the Accord that allowed a Bureau classification review to supersede an existing sapience determination. The KVETH sapience filing had been submitted by the Accord's own xenocognition panel in the Bureau's 3rd year of colonial expansion. It had not been challenged, amended, or suspended at any point in the intervening 3 decades. The filing was clean, complete, and current. Chaining a sapient classified person to a wall without due legal process was a crime under Section 44 of the Accord, which the Bureau had co-signed as a condition of its colonial operating license. Director Halst said that Dr. All's research permit had covered the acquisition of KVETH study subjects for research purposes, and that the permit had not been challenged during his lifetime. Kale said she was challenging it now. Director Halst thanked her for her feedback, slid the asset transfer document across the desk, and asked her to sign it. She looked at the document. She looked at Director Halst. She thought about the infant asleep against the mother's thorax in the amber glow of its own bioluminescence, and she thought about the chain at shoulder height, and she said no. She did not sign. She also did not sleep well in 3 days, which was why she was eating breakfast in the corridor at 700 and reading her termination letter with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She stood there reading it and noticed that she was not shaking. She was not nauseous. She felt the same way she had felt on the 3rd day of her first deep space survey posting, when the shuttle engine had developed a fault in the middle of the transit, and there had been nothing to do but calculate the options available and work through them in order, smallest to largest, most achievable to most uncertain. Fear was real. Fear was information. The question was what you did with it. She went to Bay 12 first. The KVETH female, Kale, had been calling her Sara in her own head since the 2nd day, from the KVETH word for dawn light, which was what her bioluminescence pattern most closely matched in the photographs she had cross-referenced, was awake. Her infant was also awake, making a soft, irregular sound against her thorax that KVETH xenoacoustics researchers called the comfort thrum. Sara was watching the door with the specific stillness of someone who had learned that watching the door, was the only useful action available to her. When Kale entered, Sora's light shifted, not the sharp flare of threat response, not the dim settling of resignation. Something more complex, a three-color pattern that moved from the fear-sustained blue-green through a brief yellow-orange pulse, and then settled into something Kale didn't have a filed reference for. She did not know Kaveth chromatic language with any precision. She had spent 4 years cataloging alien communication systems, and she had developed a feel for emotional grammar even when she didn't know the exact vocabulary. The way you developed a feel for the weather before you knew the technical names of cloud formations. The yellow-orange felt like something between recognition and question. "I'm still here," Kale said, because it was the only true thing she could think to say. She pulled the chair she had left there from the first day and sat down 3 feet from the cage. This was her routine, established in the first 24 hours. Come morning and evening, sit where Sora could see her, try not to look like a threat, and do nothing that required sudden movement. She had brought food both visits, the high-sulfur protein paste that Kaveth preferred, which she had found in the supply inventory under Dr. All's account, and had started drawing against without authorization on the second day. Sora had eaten it cautiously on day 2, watching Kale's hands the entire time. By day 3, she ate as soon as Kale set it down, which Kale had catalogued in her private notes as change. The infant had begun reaching for the bars with its small secondary arm sometime yesterday. Kale had noted that too. The infant twisted against Sora's primary arms and made a small, imperious sound, the sound infants made when they were hungry and were not interested in negotiating. Sora made a sound back, 3 notes descending. The comfort thrum answered. The baby settled, found its rhythm against its mother's heartbeat, and its amber light pulsed once and steadied. Kale sat there watching it happen and felt something in her chest pull tight and refused to let go, the same way it had been pulling tight since she first found this bay 3 days ago, and stood outside the cage for 2 full minutes doing nothing. She reached into her bag. The field recorder was there, warm from being carried. She had been carrying it for 6 weeks. She had found it before any of this. It had come in with the estate inventory of Dr. Saren All, a personal field recorder, the handheld variety that researchers used for their own notes and observations, too personal for bureau property, and not listed in his institutional equipment log. It had sat in the sorting queue for 3 weeks while the estate lawyers argued about what counted as private effects and what counted as research equipment. And Kale had eventually picked it up to file it when it became clear the queue was going to back up indefinitely if someone didn't make a decision. She had seen the Kaveth survey tags on the file browser and meant to scan it and file it under Dr. All's research history. That was all she meant to do. She had done that 1,000 times with 1,000 research files, and it took 40 seconds. She had opened the first file to verify the content classification. The first file was a video log. 40 minutes later, she had not moved. Dr. All's voice, somewhere in the field. Wind in the recording, a high mineral sound with a secondary tone she recognized from other survey recordings as the specific acoustic texture of Kaveth homeworlds. She had heard it in enough files to know it the way you know a smell you can't name but can't mistake. And then, Kaveth. A whole family grouping on what looked like a cliffside, all of them oriented toward the east, their bioluminescence shifting through patterns she couldn't fully read, but which felt collectively like anticipation. A female, taller than the others, with the confident posture of someone who is accustomed to being the reference point in any group. A male with one primary arm shorter than the other, an old injury healed into the bone, who moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent years compensating for an asymmetry until it became invisible. 2 juveniles racing each other along the cliff's edge, in a way that made Kale's heart stop for a half-second, before she remembered that Kaveth were entirely comfortable with heights and could grip surface irregularities with all 4 arms simultaneously. and a smaller female, barely adult, standing apart from the rest with her forearms folded inward in the posture that the xenoacoustics literature described as contemplative. As Kale watched, the sun broke the ridge. Every one of them brought their bioluminescence to full intensity at the exact moment. The light crested the horizon. Not staggered, not approximate, simultaneous, as though they had rehearsed it, or as though they had been doing it long enough that the timing lived in their bodies the way walking lived in a human's body. Their combined light, all of them blazing together against the early gold of the sunrise, was so bright on the recorder's small screen that Kale squinted. They held it for a 3 count. Then they let it fade and went about their morning, the juveniles resuming their edge race, the contemplative young female turning from the horizon with the look of someone who has received the answer to a question she didn't know she was asking. Dr. All's voice on the recording said very quietly, "Day 11. They're still doing it. Exactly the same time, exactly the same intensity. I don't think it's involuntary." That was the end of log 1. Kale went back the next day and watched the next log. There were 43 field recordings in total. She watched every one of them over 2 weeks, filling pages of handwritten notes with the names Dr. All had given to the family members, the behavioral patterns he had documented, the specific small moments that had caused him to stop what he was doing and point a recorder at them. The way the male with the healed arm always positioned himself to the left of the group, his shorter arm toward the inside, so it would be less conspicuous to anyone approaching. The way the juveniles competed fiercely and constantly at everything physical, but deferred to each other in every social decision, apparently by some system of priority that Kale couldn't fully decode, but which the younger one seemed to initiate and the older one to confirm. The food-sharing ritual that happened every evening, every family member bringing something to the center of the group, and the distribution happening in an order that Dr. All had written in the margin of one of his notes as, "I believe this is love." He had then crossed it out and written, "Social bonding mechanism, complex priority sequencing." She could still see the crossed-out version underneath. In the 37th recording, the tall female moved into the frame with a group of juveniles that weren't the family's own. Dr. All zoomed in. The tall female sat down at the juvenile's level, folded her forearms into a configuration Kale had never seen in any other recording, open, structured like a frame or a lattice, and her bioluminescence began moving in patterns that the juveniles tried to copy, their own lights flickering in inexpert imitation. Dr. All's voice, very quiet. Sara, dominant female, exceptional chromatic vocabulary, appears to be teaching the juveniles a formal greeting sequence. Watching her is like watching someone conduct a symphony with light. Kale had read the word symphony in her notes every day for 6 weeks and had not been able to make it mean less. In the 40th recording, there was footage of Sara with a newborn. The infant was days old, still trembling at the intensity of its own light, unable to control the output. It flared and faded at random, which in an adult caveth would be distress, but in a newborn was apparently just the nervous system finding its regulation. Sara was sitting at the cliff's edge with the infant held in all 4 arms, and she was showing it the sunrise. Not pointing, caveth didn't point. They used directional bioluminescent pulses. She was sending a single slow pulse toward the horizon, repeating it, and the infant was trying to follow it with its own light, managing only a random flicker but orienting toward the horizon as though it understood the direction even if not the signal. Dr. All did not say anything during that recording, he just filmed it. The 41st recording was different. Dr. All's voice was quieter than usual, with the acoustic quality of someone speaking in a room rather than in a field. He said that he had made an arrangement. He said he needed research funding for the final survey phase and had found a source. He said it wasn't what he had intended when he started this project and it wasn't ideal, but it was temporary. He said he hoped the arrangements would be brief and that the situation would be resolved before the contract period was completed. He did not say what the arrangement was. He did not say temporary by what measure, or temporary by whose definition, or what it would mean to be temporary when you were the one on the other side of it. The 42nd and 43rd recordings were blank. Cale had sat with the recorder in her hands for a long time after she understood that there was nothing on those last two files. She had thought about Dr. All watching the morning greeting ceremony 11 days in a row and writing that he didn't think it was involuntary. She had thought about the crossed-out words, "I believe this is love." She had thought about the arrangement and the word temporary, and the fact that Dr. All had died 6 weeks ago on a survey mission that was in the records as an accident. And now Sara was in Bay 12 with her infant and her arms chained over her head, and her light the color of sustained fear. Then she had requested an appointment with Director Houst. Now it was 4 days after the first appointment, and the Vreth agents were arriving tomorrow, and Cale had a termination letter in her pocket, and no authority and no legal standing, and a folder she had been building for 3 days that was either everything or nothing depending on what happened next. She sat outside the cage and thought. The thing about spending 4 years in xenobiology administration, not in the field, not in the labs, in the filing department, in the permit processing office, in the assessment queue and the archive room and the cross-reference database, was that you accumulated knowledge the same way a ship accumulated barnacles, layer by layer, most of it invisible, all of it structural. Cale had spent 4 years reading and filing and cross-referencing documents because that was her job, and in doing her job she had built a working model of how the Bureau's legal framework actually functioned, which was sometimes very different from how it was supposed to function, and sometimes the same, and knowing which was the most useful skill she had. She thought about Section 44 of the Accord, which prohibited the restraint, sale, or transfer of sapient classified persons without a judicial review and explicit authorization from the Accord's own oversight board. She thought about Section 7, subsection C, which specified that transfer of sapient classified persons between jurisdictions required authorization not from a facility director, but from a sentience review board convened by the Accord, and which further specified that commercial transactions did not constitute legal authority for such transfers. She thought about Dr. All's research permit. She thought about the permits she had filed, the hundreds of them, the way she knew their taxonomy the way a taxonomist knew species, by the shape and structure of them, by the specific language that indicated classification. A Survey Class 3 permit covered observation and non-invasive biological sampling. A Survey Class 3 permit did not cover acquisition. You needed an acquisition authorization separately, and the acquisition authorization for sapient classified subjects required a review process that took months and involved the Accord Oversight Board and could not be fast-tracked and could not be grandfathered from a general survey permit. She was almost certain Dr. All had not had one. She was almost certain, because she had filed enough permits to know what was missing from them without having to read every word. She picked up her bag and stood up. She told Sara she would be back because it was true, and because Sora's light had that yellow-orange questioning quality again, and Cale had developed enough of a feel for chromatic grammar to think it deserved an answer. The archive room was technically still accessible to her for 3 more hours. Her termination was effective at end of shift. She went to the archive room and pulled Dr. All's permit file. She read it twice. Survey Class 3, Biological Survey Documentation, standard language throughout. No acquisition authorization. No sapient subject exception. No Accord Board review documentation. No Section 7C transfer filing. Nothing. The permit that Director Houst had cited as legal cover for Sara and her infant being in that cage did not, in fact, cover it. It hadn't covered it when Dr. All had made his arrangement. It didn't cover it now. It had simply been presented as though it did, and no one who had the authority to check had been motivated to check. And that was how it worked. That was exactly how it worked. The document that was there substituting for the document that was needed because the people who needed to know the difference didn't, and the people who did know the difference had been persuaded or pressured, or simply hadn't looked. Kale made copies of the permit. She made copies of the HFY Sapiens classification from the original Accord filing, 30 years old, unambiguous, clean. She pulled the asset transfer document from the Bureau's internal records, the one she had refused to sign, and noted that it listed both subjects as biological specimens, which was not only a violation of the Sapiens classification, but was specifically prohibited under Article 8 of the Accord, which stated that no classification document issued by the Bureau or any of its contractors could override the Accord's own Sapiens determinations. She printed everything. She organized it by relevance, most critical document first. She had spent 4 years developing a filing system that she would put against anyone's. Then she took out her personal comm unit and called the Interspecies Accord Enforcement Division. The Accord documentation listed 2 contact methods: an emergency line for active violence against or unlawful restraint of sapient classified persons, a standard inquiry line with a 72-hour response window. The VRETH collective agents were arriving in less than 20 hours. Kale used the emergency line. The officer who answered had the voice of someone who had been on shift for a long time. He said his name was Varen, and told her the emergency line was designated for incidents in active progress. "There is an incident in active progress," Kale said. "A HFY female and her infant have been held in a containment cage at Colonial Research Bureau Depot 6 for 6 weeks, classified as biological specimens under a research permit that provides no legal authority for their acquisition or restraint. An unauthorized commercial transfer to a third party, the VRETH Collective, is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The VRETH Collective is not a signatory to the Interspecies Accord. If the transfer completes before a legal hold is in place, reversing it will require extradition proceedings against a non-signatory jurisdiction, which historically take between 2 and 6 years and succeed at a rate of approximately 30%. The window to act within the Accord's jurisdiction is less than 20 hours. There was a silence on the line that had a specific quality, not the silence of someone who was about to tell her she had the wrong number, but the silence of someone recalibrating. "You have documentation," Officer Varen said. "I have a copy of the research permit cited as legal authority, which contains no acquisition authorization and no sapient subject exception of any kind. I have the original HFY Sapiens determination from the Accord's Xenocognition panel, dated 30 years ago, never suspended or modified. I have the internal asset transfer document listing both subjects as biological specimens, which violates Article 8 of the Accord. I have 43 field recordings made by the researcher who brought them to this depot, documenting the subject's social behavior, language use including formal teaching sequences, tool interaction, cultural practices including what appears to be a daily communal ceremony, and complex familial bonds, all of which are sapience indicators under the Accord's own classification criteria." She paused. "I also have the researcher's own written notes describing his subjects as conducting, and I'm quoting from memory, a symphony with light." Another pause longer, she heard him typing. "Where are you calling from?" She told him. "Your name and position." She told him that too, and then added, "Former employee as of end of shift today. I have approximately 3 hours of facility access remaining." The typing continued. Then, "Stay where you are. Do not leave the facility. Do not permit the transfer to begin and do not permit the cage to be moved from its current location. I am escalating this now." "How long before I hear back?" "Hour, maybe 2. Depends on who I can reach." "I'll be in Bay 12, Kale said, "with the subjects." She went back. The hours that followed were the longest of her life, and she had once spent 11 hours in a broken shuttle waiting for rescue. This was longer. The rescue shuttle had at least been moving toward her. In Bay 12, time moved in a different direction, heavy and slow, accumulating like silt, measurable only in the intervals between Sora's movements, the infant's waking cycles, the distant sounds of the depot going about its business in ignorance of what was happening in one of its secondary bays. Kale sat in her chair. She brought food twice. She talked. She had not initially intended to talk, but the silence in Bay 12 had a particular weight, and Sora was watching her with the attentiveness of someone who was trying to read information from whatever source was available. And Kale had information that she thought Sora deserved to have, even if she wasn't certain how much of it translated. So she talked. She told Sora about Officer Varen and the documentation she had filed, and what Section 44 meant in practical terms. She told her about the permit, the specific language of a Survey Class 3 authorization versus an acquisition authorization, why the distinction mattered. She talked about the 43 recordings, carefully, because she was aware that this territory was complicated, that Dr. All had made the recordings and then made the arrangement, and she didn't know how to talk about him without the contradiction of it getting in the way, so she talked about what she had seen in them rather than who had made them. She told Sora about Log 1, the sunrise ceremony, about Log 37, the teaching sequence with the juveniles, about Log 40, the infant at the cliff's edge trying to follow the directional light pulse toward the horizon. At this point, Sora's bioluminescence shifted in a way that stopped Kale mid-sentence. It was a rapid pattern, complex, not any chromatic sequence she had cataloged in her notes. It started at the primary arms, the chained ones, still raised, still at the imposed angle, and moved down through the thorax and out through the secondary arms to where they held the infant. The baby, apparently responsive to the pattern, woke up and made a sound that was not the comfort thrum and not the hungry sound. Something different, something small and alert. Sora made 3 notes back, low and sustained, and the baby was quiet. Kale sat for a moment. That was the infant from the recording, she said. Not a question. She had known it since the first day when she compared the amber bioluminescence against the photographs she had pulled from the research files. But saying it changed something, made it more specifically real, put a weight on it that the abstracted documentary knowledge hadn't quite managed. Sora looked at her. The yellow-orange questioning pattern again, but slower this time, held longer. She was beautiful at the cliff, Kale said. The way you were showing her the light, the way she was trying to follow it even though she couldn't control the output yet. She stopped because her throat was doing something inconvenient. She breathed for a second. I have it on file. I have all 40 logs on file. I transmitted them with the documentation to the enforcement division. A pause. No one is going to delete that. Sora's light did the spreading pattern, the full greeting, thorax to extremities, building slowly to full brightness and holding there for a 3 count. Kale had seen it 6 times now, and every time it had the same effect on her, which was to make her feel seen in a way that was specific and complete and slightly overwhelming. She stayed through the night. She got the cot from the supply closet and set it up 6 feet from the cage, and she lay down on it and did not sleep much. But lying down was different from sitting up, and she needed the difference. She brought Sora food at midnight and at 400 and talked quietly for a while at both visits about nothing in particular, the depot layout, the freight schedules, the sound the loading arms made, because she thought the sound of a human voice that was not issuing orders might be more useful than silence. The infant slept most of the night against its mother's thorax, amber light steady and warm, occasionally reaching toward the cage bars in a drowsy exploratory way and then pulling back. At 2:45, Officer Varen called back. Commissioner Adele Voss of the Accord Enforcement Division's regional office was reviewing the documentation. She would be arriving at Depot 6 at 6:30. A legal hold notice was being transmitted to Director House simultaneously with this call. All transfer activities were frozen pending Commissioner Voss's review. Kale said thank you, and meant it in a way that came up from somewhere deep. She sat with the information for 20 minutes, letting it become real. Then she thought about what happened after 6:30, which was not the end of this. It was not even close to the end. The formal proceedings would take months, and the question of where Sara and her child went in the meantime was not answered, and the question of the Kaveth homeworld and its diplomatic standing was not answered, and there were 100 things that Commissioner Voss's arrival resolved, and 100 things it didn't. But it was the thing that changed the shape of the problem from unsolvable to merely very large. She thought about her mother. Her mother had worked a cargo processing job at a mid-range depot for 19 years and had never complained about it and had also never said it was fine. She had a set of practical maxims she deployed the way other people deployed, whether talk, filling a silence, smoothing a difficulty, making the atmosphere more breathable. The one she used most, for any task that looked impossible from the outside and merely enormous from the inside, was, you don't move the mountain, you move the rocks. Kale had spent 3 days moving rocks. She had moved the permit cross-reference and the sapience classification and the asset transfer document review and the field recorder transmission and the emergency line call. They were not dramatic rocks. None of them had felt like turning points. They had felt like filing tasks, like the kind of work she had been trained to do, and had been doing for 4 years without anyone caring much about it in either direction. The difference this time was what the filing was for. She thought about that for a while, and she thought about Dr. All, and she thought about the word temporary, and she thought about the crossed-out line in his notes, I believe this is love, and she thought that maybe the difference between the person who crossed it out and the person who would have left it was the difference between someone who understood what they were looking at and acted on it anyway. She did not want to understand what she was looking at. She did not want to be the kind of person who understood it and still made the arrangement. She closed her eyes and listened to the depot breathe. Director Houst appeared in Bay 12 at 5:30, which was 50 minutes before the commissioner was due. He had the look of someone who had received a legal hold notice in the middle of the night and had spent the intervening time deciding how to respond to it. He was still being polite, but the politeness now had the specific texture of someone who has realized that politeness is all that's left. He looked at Kale on her cot. He looked at the folder in her lap. He looked at Sara and then looked away from Sara quickly, and Kale noted the speed of the looking away and filed it. You've made this very complicated, he said. It was always complicated, Kale said. The complication was always there. I just moved it somewhere you had to look at it. The Vreth agents have paid. The transfer is illegal under Section 44 of the Accord and under Article 8, and the commercial transaction does not constitute legal authority for the transfer under Section 7c. The Vreth Collective can file for a refund through the Bureau's commercial dispute process as a good-faith transaction made in error. She had read this in the Accord documentation at 400 and had memorized the specific phrasing because she had a feeling she was going to need it. The Bureau's liability is limited to the refund amount under the standard commercial error clause. Houst was quiet for a moment. In the background, Sora's infant made a small sound. Neither of them looked at the cage. You are not an employee, Houst said. No, I'm a witness, and I'm the person who compiled the documentation that the commissioner is reviewing when she arrives in approximately an hour. I'll be available to answer her questions. She held up the folder, which I have already transmitted in full along with the field recordings to Officer Varon. The 12-second silence was back, the calculating kind. Your employment record, he said, will be very difficult to work with in Bureau-affiliated facilities. You understand that? She had thought about this. She had thought about it every night for 3 days, lying awake in her quarters with the recorder on the pillow next to her and the 43rd file ending in blank static. She had thought about it the way you think about a calculation you've already done and don't need to do again, The answer was there, stable, not going to change. "Yes," she said, "I understand that." He waited for something else. She had nothing else to offer. He turned and left. Commissioner Adele Voss arrived at 6:28, 2 minutes early, and she brought with her 2 Accord officers and a legal analyst who had the look of someone accustomed to making decisions at speed. She was about 60, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular efficiency of carriage that Cale associated with people who had spent their careers making bureaucratic systems do things they were built to avoid doing. She came to Bay 12 first. She stood outside the cage and looked at Sara with the specific, calibrated attention of someone assessing a situation that she will shortly be responsible for. Sara's light shifted in the pattern that Cale had never seen before, rapid, complex, too fast to track individual colors, moving from the thorax outward in a way that felt like an organized statement rather than a reflexive response. Cale checked her notes instinctively, found nothing that matched. She thought, Sara knows what this person represents. She doesn't know how to feel about it. The light is her working through both at once. "You're Morden," Commissioner Voss said. "Yes." "Walk me through it." Cale walked her through it. The permit, starting with its classification and working through the specific language that was absent from it, the acquisition authorization, the Section 7C transfer filing, the Accord Oversight Board documentation, the sapience determination, 30 years old and unmodified, the asset transfer document and its classification violations, the 43 field recordings and the sapience indicators present in them, formal communication systems, cultural ceremonies, educational behaviors, complex social bonds. Commissioner Voss went through each document with the deliberate, unhurried precision of someone who was not going to miss anything and knew it. She asked 4 questions. They were precise, technical questions about the permit's issue date relative to Dr. All's survey start date, about the specific Accord article that governed sapience determination appeals, about the chain of custody documentation for the field recordings. Cale answered all 4 without hesitating. The commissioner handed the folder to her legal analyst and turned to the door. Director Halst was there. He had the expression of someone who has run completely out of options and has moved into the territory of simply waiting for things to resolve around him. "Director," Commissioner Voss's voice was professionally even, "I'm issuing a provisional protective order under Article 12 of the Accord, effective as of this moment. The KVETH subjects are reclassified as persons of interest pending a formal sapience determination, which will confirm the existing classification for the record. All transfer activities are suspended without a fixed end date, pending the completion of that determination. I'll require your facility's full cooperation in arranging medical assessment and appropriate accommodation for both subjects." She paused. "I'll also require that the restraint be removed immediately." Hal said nothing for a moment. Then, "The VRETH agents will be informed that the transaction cannot be completed and that a formal refund process is available to them through your Bureau's Commercial Dispute Office." The professional evenness did not vary. "I'll draft the notification myself, if that's easier for your team." She had said, "I'll draft it myself," the way you might offer to bring an extra cup of coffee. Cale loved her for it. Halst made a gesture to the staff member standing behind him. 30 seconds later, someone arrived with bolt cutters. Cale stood and watched the chain come off. It took 4 cuts, because the alloy was load-bearing grade, the kind that didn't give easily. The sound it made coming apart was not dramatic, a series of sharp, industrial sounds, nothing more. But each cut changed Sara's posture by a degree. She was lowering her primary arms as each section of chain released, slowly, the way you lower something you are afraid of dropping because you are not sure yet whether it will hold. She lowered them to her sides. She stood there for a moment with all 4 arms at her sides, completely free, and her bioluminescence ran through a sequence of colors that Cale had no notes on, had no reference for, had nothing in 4 years of xenobiology filing to compare to. Then Sora gathered her infant into all 4 arms at once and brought her bioluminescence to full intensity. The light blazed white in the fluorescent ugliness of Bay 12. It held there, the 3 count of the morning greeting ceremony, the 3 count from the cliff in the first recording, the 3 count Kale had watched 11 times before she understood it wasn't involuntary. It held at full intensity, and then it held past the 3 count. It held for 5 counts, for 8, for what felt like an entirely unreasonable amount of time. The whole bay washed in Kaveth bioluminescence, and the infant's amber warmth within it like a small separate sun. When it finally faded, the pattern that replaced it was the devoted color. The shade from the 40th recording, from the cliff, from the infant learning to follow the light toward the horizon. The thorax to extremities wash of warm blue-green that had no good translation in standard human, because the Kaveth concept it expressed was specific to a kind of love that had survived something and come out the other side and was demonstrating, with every wavelength available to it, that it was still intact. Kale pressed her hands together and looked at the floor for a moment. Commissioner Voss appeared beside her. "You've been here all night." "Yes. As a non-employee. My termination was effective end of shift yesterday. Technically, I was still a former employee in good standing for the first 2 hours of the night." She paused. "After that, I was just here." The commissioner regarded her with the particular careful attention that Kale had learned to recognize in people who were deciding whether someone was worth the investment of their time. It was a look that required honesty to meet, and Kale was too tired to be anything but honest. "The documentation you compiled is exceptional," Commissioner Voss said. "The permit analysis is precisely the kind of work that people with 15 years of accord enforcement experience produce. The field recording evidence was sufficient by itself to trigger an emergency review. The permit cross-reference was not something most people would have known to look for or how to use." She paused. "You've been doing xenobiology administration for 4 years. Filing mostly, permits, assessment reports, archive cross-reference." The Accord Enforcement Division has 3 open compliance reviewer positions. The commissioner picked up the folder and held it out. "The work involves a great deal of permit reading. The pay is what it is. The hours are not glamorous, and the facilities are worse than this one, which I realize is a low bar." Kale took the folder. "I'm very good at permits," she said. "I know." Commissioner Voss looked at her steadily. "I read yours." The processing took the rest of the morning. Medical assessment, accommodation arrangements, the formal paperwork of a provisional protective order, the notification to the Vreth Collective, the administrative record corrections. The legal analyst worked with the speed of someone who had done this before in places where speed was the only available tool. Commissioner Voss signed documents with the efficiency of someone for whom signature was the last step of a process, not a ceremony. Director Halst signed where he was asked to sign. He did not say anything else to Kale. Kale spent most of those hours in the chair outside Bay 12, which was no longer the right phrase for it because the cage door was open. She drank bad depot coffee and watched the freight arms move through the secondary bay window and thought about her mother's rocks. She had moved a lot of rocks in 3 days. The permit analysis was a rock. The Sapiens classification pull was a rock. The asset transfer document was a rock. The 43 recordings were a rock. The emergency line call was a rock. None of them had felt like turning points. None of them had felt like a single decisive action. They had felt like filing tasks, like the work she had done for 4 years while nobody was paying particular attention to it, except this time the filing was for something, and she had known while doing it that the something was worth the effort. An Accord compliance reviewer. More permits, more cross-references, more archive work. More of the same work in the same quiet, invisible way in a worse facility for adequate pay. More rocks, more mountains. More situations where the thing that changed everything was a document filed correctly, a permit cross-referenced against an Accord article, a field recorder picked up from a queue that had been backing up for weeks. She thought, that's fine. That's exactly fine. You don't have to be the person who storms the gate. You have to be the person who knows what the permit says. One of Commissioner Voss's officers came to tell her they were ready to move the subjects to provisional accommodation. She went back to Bay 12. The cage door was standing open. Sarah was in the doorway of it, not fully inside and not fully out, her feet on the threshold, 4 arms wrapped around the infant in the full hold. She had been in the cage for 6 weeks. She was not rushing. Cale understood that. She stood at the entrance to the bay and let Sarah look at her, and look at the open corridor beyond the door, and look at Commissioner Voss's officers standing at a respectful distance. And she waited. Sarah's bioluminescence moved slowly through a sequence that Cale watched without trying to analyze. She had spent 6 weeks learning to read this light, and what she had learned above everything else was that there was a level of it that was past analysis, past cataloging, past the notes she had been keeping. Some of it was just the thing itself, the way certain music was the thing itself, not a statement about an emotion but the emotion, conducted in the only medium available. Sarah looked at her. The full greeting came, final and complete. Thorax to extremities, 3-beat hold at full brightness, the light that said, I see you, I know you, you are part of this. And then the other pattern, the one that had come after the chain came off. The devoted color, moving slow, sustained, not the same as the infant watch shade but related to it, the same family of expression, the same underlying wavelength, and Cale stood in the doorway and felt it under her ribs where music lived, in the place that didn't need words, and she let herself feel it without looking for a note to file it under. The infant made a small, imperious sound. Sarah made the 3 descending notes back. Then, for the first time since Cale had been watching, the infant made 3 descending notes in response, imprecise, childish. The notes slightly off but the shape of the pattern intact. Sarah's light blazed briefly. A single brilliant pulse of something that might have been a laugh if it had been translated into human coordinates. Cale felt herself smiling. She had not expected to feel like smiling. It felt appropriate anyway. Okay, she said to the room, to the open cage door, to whatever was next. Okay. Outside, the freight arms were moving. The depot was breathing its slow structural rhythm, the same rhythm it would breathe tomorrow and the day after, going about its business in the way that things went about their business. The manifest arriving at 700, the supply invoices, the termination letters in with everything else. In 2 hours the next shift would start, and someone else would be in the filing archive, and the permits would be stacked in the same order, and none of it would have changed, because most things didn't change because of a single night in a secondary bay with a cot and a folder and bad coffee. But Sarah was standing in open air for the first time in 6 weeks with all 4 arms free and her child held in every one of them. And her bioluminescence was the steady, warm, complex color of something that had survived and was still itself. And the infant's amber light was pulsing against the gray, fluorescent ceiling of the depot in a rhythm that was alive and specific and irreplaceable. Cale picked up her bag. She tucked the folder under her arm. She put the recorder in her coat pocket, where the termination letter was, and she thought about keeping both of them, the letter and the recorder together, the document of the choice and the document of what the choice had been for. She walked out of Depot 6 into the transit corridor, and then into the connector port, and then into whatever was beyond it, carrying 43 field recordings and 1 personnel file, and 4 years of knowing exactly how permits worked, and thinking that the mountain was enormous and most of it was other people's rocks to move, and she was going to help move them anyway. She did not take the long way around the coolant spill this time. She walked through the main corridor, the one she had been walking for 4 years, past the archive room and the permit processing office and the assessment queue. She walked through it the same way she always had, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to herself. And she thought that invisibility was a tool like any other, and the question was what you were invisible in service of. She had been invisible in service of nothing in particular for 4 years. She had filed and cross-referenced and cataloged, and done the work well without anyone much noticing whether it was done well or badly, which was the normal condition of most work in most places and was not a complaint, merely an observation. She had done something visible, finally, and it had cost her exactly what she had calculated it would cost her: the job, the employment record, the bureau affiliation, and she had paid it without being sorry, which was a different thing from not minding. She minded. She had liked this job, or at least she had liked the version of this job that had existed before she understood what was in Bay 12, and you couldn't like a thing and not mind losing it. But you could mind it and still know you'd make the same call again. She thought about the 41st recording. She thought about Dr. All's voice, quiet, slightly airless, saying it wasn't what he had intended when he started the project. She believed him. She thought it was very likely true that he had not intended it, had not planned for it, had not sat down one day and decided to become the person who made the arrangement. She thought he had probably moved toward it gradually, one small rationalization at a time, each step small enough to seem like not a step, and that was the other way it worked. Not the person who understood what they were looking at and acted on it anyway, but the person who understood what they were looking at and added a word like temporary so they could keep looking. She did not think she was better than Dr. All in any way that mattered structurally. She thought she had been in a different position, with a different set of pressures and no funding crisis, and a filing archive, and a dormant recorder, and 43 logs that had been waiting in a queue for weeks to be sorted by whoever got there first. She had gotten there first, that was the whole of it. You could not plan to get there first. You could only make sure that when you got there, you knew what the permit said. The transit connector opened onto the outer docking ring, and the outer docking ring had a view that she had walked past 1,000 times without stopping to look at. A wide panel of reinforced glass, and beyond it the depot's exterior, the docking arms and cargo pods and the dark behind them. She stopped this time. The dark was specific and extensive. In it, somewhere extremely far away, a Kveth family had watched the sunrise from a cliffside for 11 consecutive days while a researcher filmed them and wrote in his notes that it didn't look involuntary. In it, somewhere somewhat closer, the Vreth Collective's agents were in transit toward a transaction that was no longer happening. In it, the next thing she was going to do existed somewhere, not yet visible, waiting to be moved toward. Commissioner Voss's offer was real. The work was real. The permits were real and the archive cross-references were real, and the mountains were very large and largely composed of other people's rocks, and she was going to spend a career moving them in the quiet, efficient, invisible way, and that was fine. That was exactly fine. That was what the work required. She stood at the glass for a moment and let the dark be the dark. The infant's amber bioluminescence in the 40th field recording had pulsed twice against the early horizon light while Sora sent it directional signals it couldn't yet follow. Imprecise. Childish. The nervous system finding its regulation, but pointed in the right direction, oriented toward the thing being shown to it even without the capacity yet to reproduce it. Kale thought, that's enough. You don't have to be able to reproduce it yet. You have to be pointed at it. She picked up her bag and walked toward what came next.